Hi everybody and welcome to Heel Heat. My name is George Coles and on this episode we're doing a top 10. Topic of the top 10, commentary teams. Now I will say, for the commentators that worked alone, they didn't get to make this list. This is all team-ups, and this is what I think the best of those team-ups would be. And we're going to go right into it. Starting with number 10, Taz and Michael Cole. Michael Cole has had a lot of really good partners over the years. JBL, Pat McAfee, Corey Graves. But I think he was at his absolute best when him and Taz were together. And Taz has had other partners as well, Tenay, Excalibur, so on and so on. I really enjoyed this grouping, especially how they were paired up in that era of WWE. To me, when I look back at that era, they're the announced team that I think of the best. And I really like how they worked with each other. Michael Cole, he's starting to get a lot more respect now than he has been historically. I think what a lot of his problem was is he's the guy that basically replaced JR, and it would kind of be like the guy that replaces Tom Brady. You know, you have one of the all-time greats being replaced by someone. If you're not following them up with another all-time great, the fans aren't going to like it. I love this team. That's why they're on my list. And from that, our number 9, Mararello and Josh Barnett. This was the Access TV commentary team for New Japan Pro Wrestling for a good while. I think they were over a year, maybe 2 years. And as I was making this list, I was trying to think of where I liked Morrow the best, because I did want to put Morrow on this list. I think he's a great announcer. And to me, his best work was with Josh Barnett. Maybe it's because they had more freedom. He didn't have somebody barking in his ear. Maybe it's because of the era that they were announcing, with the rise of the Bullet Club, Okada being a bigger star, Tanahashi being in his prime, Naito becoming a bigger star. That all ties into it. Jay White breaking out. All of that around this era makes it such a great team. And I know it's one that a lot of people haven't really seen, because I've seen the numbers for when New Japan was on Access TV. I think they still are on Access TV. I stopped watching it on Access TV because I have New Japan World, so I can watch basically what's going to be on Access TV in a month or two now. So yeah, I enjoyed them as a team. I think they're fantastic. Even though they were short-lived, I thought they were really good. Now coming from that, our number 8, Kevin Kelly and Steve Corino from Ring of Honor. This would have been right about the same time as Morrow and Josh Barnett in New Japan Pro Wrestling. And again, this is another thing. It ties with the rise of the Bullet Club. It ties with Adam Cole. It ties with that era of Ring of Honor where we're seeing a lot of the stars of today were in Ring of Honor at the time these guys were doing the commentary. And when I say stars, they were stars in Ring of Honor, but some of the guys that are main eventers in WWE and AEW, this is where they were really breaking out at the time. And there was something so special about that era, something about everything that was done there. I love this team. I think Corino and Kelly played so well off each other, because first off, Kevin Kelly is a fantastic announcer, and Corino is such a wrestling historian that even while being a color man, he added so much to that. I really enjoyed this. I thought it was awesome. That's why it's on our list. Now, this next one is probably going to have a lot of the older wrestling fans angry. Number 7, Jim Ross and Gordon Soley. There are a lot of people that consider Gordon Soley the best commentator in wrestling. And I've seen a lot of his stuff, especially his Florida Championship Wrestling stuff, some of his Continental Championship Wrestling stuff, and obviously this era in Jim Crockett promotion. Soley, to me, was more of your old school sports announcer. Not that that's a bad thing, but he was kind of like a Pat Summerall or a Vince Scully for the Dodgers. He was very dry, very matter of fact. And I don't know if it's a generational thing, if because of the generation I grew up in and the announcers that I was first introduced to, which we'll get to them in a list in a little bit, he just never really stood out to me that much. Now, this pairing with Jim Ross, it was awesome. I enjoyed this. This really felt like Summerall and John Madden, if you were watching football back in the day, where Jim Ross got to play the John Madden character. And both of them approached it as a sport. I really enjoyed this pairing. Again, this is my favorite of Gordon Soley as a commentator, and I know that's going to get a lot of flames because this is so low, and spoiler, this is going to be Gordon Soley's only appearance on this list. So yeah, go Go ahead and throw it in the comments for you guys that are older that remember him fondly. To me, I think he's the lesser of the two guys on this team. I'll go from that. Our number 6, one of the commentary teams I grew up watching, as I just mentioned, and may have clouded my vision of Gordon, Jesse the Body Ventura and Gorilla Monsoon. Now, a lot of people point Jesse and Vince or Gorilla and Heyman, but this grouping was, to me, it felt like this was a pay-per-view announced team. When Jesse and Gorilla would get together, I feel like it was, not so much to say a more important show, but it added to that big fight fee. Jesse the Body Ventura is one of the best color men in wrestling history, and Gorilla being the straight man, being the good guy, playing off of him, playing off of Heyman, playing off of anybody who was in the booth with him, he was so good at what he did. Both guys were super animated. I love them as a pairing, hence why they're number 6 on my list. Going from that, our number 5, Jim Ross and Paul Heyman, aka Paulie Dangerously, both in their time in WWE and their time in WCW. You could tell there was an animosity between the two, because that added to who his character was. Paul Heyman was supposed to be annoying. Paulie Dangerously was supposed to be annoying. And I think they're a brilliant team. I mean, here you have Jim Ross, who I'm going to flat out say it, I consider the best single announcer of all time. And you have Paul Heyman, one of the greatest talkers in all of wrestling history. I mean, I would put him up there with anybody on commentary, anybody on promos, anybody that's ever touched a microphone. Paul Heyman's probably in the very short list of best orators in the history of wrestling. I would put him top 5, top 3, maybe even top 1. He's up there with The Rock. He's up there with CM Punk, Steve Austin, Ric Flair, anyone you could think of. My only regret is this is both times they were a team, they weren't a team for very long. I wish they would have been together much longer. And if they would have, they'd probably be much higher on this list. We'll go from that, our number 4. The voices of Memphis Wrestling, Lance Russell and Dave Brown. Now, I mentioned with Gordon Soley, his dryness and his matter of fact. Lance Russell was that as well. Dave Brown was dry and matter of fact. However, where I give Lance Russell the nod over Soley is Lance would get frustrated. Lance would get angry with the heels. And Dave Brown would have to calm him down. Dave Brown was the cooler head 99% of the time. And I know there's a bunch of people that don't like this team at all. I've heard that very often, matter of fact. But to me, I thought they were perfect for the product that was going on in front of them. The craziness of Memphis wrestling with the sports-based calling of Russell and Brown, it just made it feel important. It felt like there was a gravitas added to what was going on with the mayhem, whether it be fireballs or one of the many shenanigans that Jerry Lawler pulled off or Bill Dundee pulled off. These guys added to everything that was done there, and I love them as a team. I think they were the perfect team for that promotion. That's why they're so high on my list. I'll go from that, our number 3, Joel Gertner and Joey Styles. If I would have considered just single commentators, Joey Styles is very high on the list. Joey Styles is the voice of ECW. There's no and, if, or buts about that. He is the guy whose voice you hear when you think of ECW. And for the most part, it's him by himself. Now, when we got to pay-per-view or we got to TNN, you had them bring in Cyrus, aka Don Callis, and Joel Gertner to team up with him at different times. And while I liked him and Cyrus, the connection with him and Gertner, I felt more organic. It felt more like they really were friends and they were really playing off of each other. I really love this team and I love Joey Styles by himself. He almost single-handedly put them this high. But Joel Gertner, with his quips, with his witticism, with his entendres, I really love this. This was a great team. That's why they're so high on my list. Going from that, our number 2. If I'm getting a lot of heat from my number 7 with Gordon Soley and Jim Ross, this will probably be the other one that gets me a lot of heat too. This is one where I hear a lot of people say this is the number 1 team of all time. And that's Gorilla Monsoon and Bobby the Brain. And I know, I feel it. I understand. Leave it in the comments how frustrated you are that they're not number 1. I get it. This, to me, is the team that is synonymous with my childhood. This is the team I heard most. This was the team that I watched every week. The comic timing of Bobby the Brain Heenan is unmatched by almost anybody in the history of wrestling. No one in the history of wrestling is more witty than Bobby Heenan. I mean, he's just exactly what he says he is. He's a genius. He's the brain. This is such a great pairing, and I love them together. This is what you would say like a quintessential buddy cop movie is what these guys are, basically. I love Gorilla and the Brain. Unfortunately, they are my number 2, and we are going to see here in a little bit who my number 1 is. But before we get there, we're going to talk about the best of the rest. If you haven't seen my top 10s before, this is basically things that were considered for the top 10 but didn't quite make it. First up, Mike Tenay and Jerry West. First up, Mike Tenay and Don West. A lot of people hate Don West, and I always found his enthusiasm made up for his lack of wrestling knowledge. The way he was able to sell things, bouncing off of Mike Tenay, who is a callback to the Gordon Soley style, to the Lance Russell style, to the more sports announcer-based commentary. Mike Tenay's wrestling knowledge carried the knowledge part of it. Don West's entertainment value took up that part of it. And I thought they worked perfectly together. Don West gets a lot of hate, and not so much now that he's passed away, but before he passed, he fell on a lot of people's least favorite commentator lists. I always loved his enthusiasm. When I think of TNA, even now that they haven't been a commentating team for over a decade, I still think of them as the voices of TNA. I really loved them as a team. That's why they were thought of, but unfortunately didn't make the list. Now, last but not least, on the best of the rest, Bob Caudle and Dutch Mantel. This was a commentary team from Smoky Mountain Wrestling, and there really is something to be said about the presentation of Smoky Mountain Wrestling. It had that old school feel to it without feeling dated. It still felt like it was up to date. It still feels relevant today. Smoky Mountain Wrestling, now, for it being a product that was wrestling the way that it used to be, it holds up now 30 years later better than stuff from WWF, WCW at the time may. And a lot of that is the commentary. A lot of that is the in-ring action. The in-ring is always solid. A good wrestling match is always going to be a good wrestling match. Styles may change, but Ric Flair versus Dusty Rhodes is always going to be great. Matches with teams like the Heavenly Bodies versus the Rock and Roll Express or the Gangstas, guys like Chris Candido, Dirty White Boy, Tracy Smothers. There was a lot of great talent in that little company. And this commentary team is awesome. I think Dutch Mantel is one of the most underrated people in all of wrestling history. He's a guy that even to this day, I listen to his podcast every week. He puts out 2 a week, I believe. And they're both very, very good, highly entertaining. I definitely recommend checking that out, Storytime with Dutch Mantel. His host there, James, I always forget what James's last name is. James, if you ever watch this, I am sorry, but you are awesome. I think you're a great host. You are perfect for the role that you're in. You and Dutch are great. I loved your podcast you had with Don Morocco for a while. I love what you did with Shane Douglas. I love what you're doing with Stevie Richards. If you ever watch this, which you probably never will. But again, I love Dutch and Bob Caudle. I thought this was an awesome pairing. Now, before I get into number 1, if you think I put a team too high, a team too low, left one off the list altogether, let me know down here in the comments. With all that being said, my number 1 commentary team in the history of pro wrestling, probably already guessed it by their omission off the rest of the list, Jerry the King Lawler and Jim Ross. As much as I love Gorilla Monsoon and Bobby Heenan, Lance Russell and Dave Brown, Joey Styles and Joel Gertner, anyone else on this group, the best team that was ever put together is Jim Ross and Jerry the King. For my money, Jim Ross is the single best commentator in the history of pro wrestling. And for all of the historic moments that these guys called together, for all of the times they were sitting behind that table while the Attitude Era was on, while Stone Cold was kicking ass, while Mankind was getting thrown off the cell, while The Rock was rising to fame, while John Cena and Brock Lesnar came, all of those times, that voice, those voices are so ingrained with some of the greatest moments in wrestling history, and they make everything better. I mean, you have everything for, by God Almighty, he's broken in half, Stone Cold, Stone Cold, Stone Cold, and everything in there. And you got Jerry Lawler, which, if you go back, there is some of it that doesn't hold up. It's very misogynistic, but I'm going to give it a little bit of a pass because it is of the time. On a TV show where it wasn't uncommon to see boobs and women called hoes and bra and panty matches and other stuff of that nature, and yes, I know a lot of that comes from the twisted mind of Vince McMahon, I'm going to give Jerry Lawler a pass because he was calling it basically as it happened, and I mean, it was a different time. The camaraderie between these two is so palatable. It's like you're sitting there watching a show with two great friends, and they've brought you into their world, and you're sitting right next to them. It makes you feel like you're sitting there with them. To me, Jim Ross and Jerry the King Lawler is the best team of all time. I just love everything about him. And this is coming from a guy who, during the time, mostly of the Monday Night Wars, I thought of WWE as the third best company. During a lot of the NWO run, I thought WCW was better. During the entirety of the Monday Night Wars, I thought ECW was better. But these guys are the icons. These are the high watermark, the best that's ever done it. I absolutely love. Now again, if you don't agree, let me know down here in the comments. If you do agree, if you think JR and the King are the best, let me know down here in the comments as well. With all that being said, my name is George Coles, and you've been watching a Heel Heat Top 10.